If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, and it can be heard on Spotify, Apple, and many other platforms. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Now download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started. That is ANCHOR.FM. About 10 years ago, the former head of Cuban intelligence, Fabian Escalante, told a British documentary team the CIA had tried to kill Fidel Castro more than 600 times over a period of about 40 years. In a series of bungled and harebrained schemes, like in James Bond or Get Smart, the CIA overwhelmingly failed to kill Castro. So successfully did the US spies not kill the Cuban leader that he was able to die of natural causes. Was Escalante exaggerating? That's hard to say, but we know from declassified CIA reports, as well as the testimony of some would-be assassins, that the agency did try to kill Castro plenty of times. Not all of these plans were executed. Many were just ideas plucked from the fevered imagination of the world's most powerful spy agency. They inevitably shriveled up when exposed to reality. Somewhere behind this list of exploding cigars and flesh-eating wetsuits are a bunch of nameless inventors in what must have been a pretty surreal office culture. More than anything, the list suggests a complex, tangled bureaucracy that was able to insulate personnel from external review, while giving them unlimited resources to kill a distant, powerful figure of myth, the Phantom Menace of the United States. This went on for years, and in that time, President John F. Kennedy was shot dead by a gunman in Dallas. The Kennedy administration had tried to kill Castro about 42 times. In this turmoil, it's hard to forget some of the hilarious, bonkers, and downright wild attempts to end his life. These are the numerous attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. Welcome back to Crime and Cryptic, where we investigate criminals, cover-ups, and all things covert. I'm your host, Haley, and today we're going to take a deep dive inside the CIA's plots to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Let's first start with a little context. A series of newspaper reports in the 1970s led to a government investigation of the CIA's abuses of power. President Ford banned political assassinations in 1976, but according to the head of the Cuban intelligence agency, they continued for 2 more decades, including in the 90s under President Clinton. First, let's talk about the infamous exploding cigar plan. Fidel Castro was rather fond of a cigar, and it became a symbol. A newspaper reported that a year earlier, the CIA had approached a New York police officer with the idea of giving Castro a cigar packed with enough explosives to take his head off. This has never been confirmed, though we know the CIA did use cigars for another, separate assassination attempt. In 1960, the CIA laced a box of Castro's favorite kind of cigars with poison, but the package never made it to Castro. Just a year after Castro seized power, the agency spiked the cigars with a botulinum toxin, strong enough to kill anybody who put one in their mouth. The cigars were delivered to an unidentified person in 1961, according to the subcommittee, but it's unclear what happened to them after that. Needless to say, we know they were never chewed by El Comandante. This was only the first in a slew of attempts. One of my favorites was conducted in 1961 in Havana. Castro loved ice cream just as much as he loved cigars, and the CIA planned to ruin his dessert. To do this, they asked for help from the casino mafia, who had been kicked off the island after Castro took power and outlawed gambling. According to some accounts, the mafia was able to slip a jar of poisoned pills to a cafe worker in the capital of Havana. After they failed with the mob, things got a little wacky. Some say the worker was meant to slip in the poison to an ice cream cone, others say it was a milkshake. But at the crucial moment, the poison could not be dislodged from inside the freezer. It was frozen stuck. Either way, this was the closest that the CIA would get to sweet success, and it was all ruined by a hunk of ice. It seems like the CIA liked targeting Castro's favorite pastimes. He liked diving in the ocean, and the CIA took that idea and just ran with it. In 1963, the CIA bought large amounts of brightly colored mollusks to pack with explosives. It would be rigged to explode and then dropped into one of Castro's favorite diving spots. While no evidence suggests that these mollusks were ever deployed, I would still be careful when picking up a suspicious-looking shell off the coast of Cuba. Who knows? Maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis will only follow with the Cuban Shell Crisis. This leads me into the next plot. Fidel Castro loved diving, like, a lot. So the CIA came up with another plan, and this one went pretty far. In 1961, a high-profile American lawyer, James Donovan, came very close. The gadget's arms of the CIA dusted the inside of a diving suit with fungus that caused a chronic skin disease and put tuberculosis in the breathing apparatus. Isn't that a fun combination? All they needed to do was to get Castro to put it on. That same American lawyer who had been leading negotiations with Castro would become their unwitting accomplice and present the suit to the Cuban leader. The plan fell apart when the man was tipped off by a CIA lawyer. He then switched out the wetsuit for one that was perfectly normal. Then there were attempts to discredit Castro in front of his nation instead of just killing him. In 1960, the CIA planned to sabotage Castro's speeches by spraying his broadcasting studio with a chemical that would make him suffer similar hallucinations to LSD. They planned to spray the studio with this chemical so that he would hallucinate on air and embarrass himself. Obviously, this one didn't fall through. Yet another scheme was to dust the inside of Castro's shoes with a chemical that would make his iconic beard fall out. This is the same chemical that is used in Nair for body hair. Thallium salts. Obviously, the clumsy agents couldn't enact this plan either. In the end, Fidel had the good fortune of growing old, bearded, and not tripping balls. Now, if we're thinking James Bond films, Marita Lorenz was Castro's femme fatale. Here's one thing I hadn't heard of until I started researching for this episode. Lorenz told Vanity Fair in 1993 that while she was Castro's lover in late 1959, she was recruited as a contract agent for the CIA and tasked with assassinating the Cuban leader. That's pretty intriguing. She was given 2 botulinum toxin pills to drop in Castro's drink, so her story goes. Just one would kill him in 30 seconds, but she got cold feet. Quote, "I knew the minute I saw the outline of Havana, I couldn't do it," she told Vanity Fair, describing her emotions on landing in the Cuban capital. Even if she had wanted to kill him, she had botched the job. She said she stashed the pills in a cold cream jar that made them gunky and unusable. In any case, Castro had her shaken up. He pulled out his .45 and handed it to me, she recounted. He didn't even flinch, and he said, "You can't kill me. Nobody can kill me." And he kind of smiled and chewed on his cigar. I felt deflated. He was so sure of me. Now, here's one that I think should have worked out. The CIA plotted its plan to kill Castro using a hypodermic needle concealed within a pen. This would be painless and almost impossible to notice when used. The needle would be so fine that, quote, "the victim would not notice its insertion," according to the church committee. Its report said the needle was to be rigged to poison and injected into Castro by a highly placed Cuban official who was in discussions with the CIA. However, the Cuban official did not think much of the device and complained that surely the CIA could come up with something more sophisticated. Now, the official also suffered bad timing. He offered the pen on November 2nd, 1963, the date of John F. Kennedy's assassination. The event saw the agency withdraw its support from the attempt on Castro's life, and the official never took the pen to Cuba. I really wonder where some of these artifacts are. It would be amazing to see some of these devices. Maybe the CIA still has them. They might have been destroyed, as they were a bit incriminating for the already shady agency. Let's look at a few more, because there is an alleged 638 plots. These are just the highlights. Notably, 2 Cuban exiles sent to kill Castro got cold feet. In May of 1975, 2 Cuban exiles were flown into Cuba by the CIA. The CIA apparently then airdropped Springfield rifles with telescopic sights to help the agents along. The plan fell apart and they were no help. The CIA must have really needed to work on their strategy. It's almost like Castro was untouchable. The CIA was in touch with a bunch of mobsters, including well-known hoodlums in the Chicago area, another in Miami, and several in Cuba. The CIA was going to pay $150,000 to a gunman hired by a mobster to take Castro out. Only 6 people ever knew about this plan while it was happening, according to this document. This all led J. Edgar Hoover, the controversial FBI director at the time, to send a memo to Attorney General Robert Kennedy titled Central Intelligence Agency's Intentions to Send Hoodlums to Cuba to Assassinate Castro. And Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General at the time and the President's brother, wasn't thrilled about this plan. Attorney General Kennedy stated that the CIA should never undertake the use of mafia people again without first checking with the Department of Justice, because it would be difficult to prosecute such people in the future. Now, why did people want to kill Castro in the first place? Let's look at some context. The name Castro evokes many different feelings throughout Cuba. There is a strong divide among his own people. He is either seen as a beloved saint or a ruthless murderer. However, the U.S. government has consistently viewed him as only one thing, a dangerous revolutionary who must be dealt with by any means necessary. Castro's legacy is one of complexity and controversy, and the split in perceptions of heroism and tyranny along racial and ethnic lines goes beyond the contentious relationship between the U.S. and Cuba. For some, Castro's vision and implementation of Cuban internationalism and contributions to anti-colonialistic movements significantly impacted the lives of millions of people throughout the world. Castro focused largely on medical and educational collaborations and furthering the fight against imperial rule, providing military assistance that led to independence in Namibia and the end of apartheid rule in South Africa. Thousands of Africans have been educated in Cuba over the past 5 decades, with costs of attendance being split between the Cuban government and the government of the students' nation. In Latin America and the Caribbean, Castro is regarded as an outstanding friend and genuine partner who has helped develop independent countries across the hemisphere. Over the past 4 decades, Cuba has trained thousands of Caribbean nationals in various disciplines at no cost to the students. Castro is also recognized for his responses to international crises, most notably for the work of Henry Reeve Brigade, a group of more than 1,200 Cuban doctors and nurses who were among the first on the ground following the earthquake in Haiti in 2010 and the Ebola outbreak in 2014. The U.S. turned down Cuba's offer of medical assistance following Hurricane Katrina's devastation on the Gulf Coast in 2005. But Cuba's educational internationalism has still extended itself to the people of the United States. Nearly 2,400 American students, many of whom are of color and from low-income households, were enrolled in Cuban universities during the 2014-2015 academic year. While Castro is noted for his unwavering commitment to medical, military, and educational internationalism in the African diaspora, legacy among Black individuals is contrasted by the treatment of Afro-Cubans in his own country. Any forms of dissent and criticism among the revolutionary government had been met with imprisonment, and the majority of those Cubans are of African descent. To date, the number of executions carried out by the Cuban government is still unclear, but estimates range from 10,000 to 100,000 people, with the last known executions taking place in 2003. Cuba's human rights problems are heavily cited as evidence of Castro's tyrannical manner in governing the people of Cuba. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Committee on Torture has repeatedly engaged in dialogue with Cuban officials on the subjects of censorship, fair and expeditious asylum procedures, detention conditions, preventative security measures, death penalty, and deaths in custody, most recently in 2012. As of May 2012, the prison population of Cuba totals 57,337, many of whom have been detained for voicing critiques of the government. But condemnation of Castro and the Cuban government, however, can in turn be said of the United States government, as our nation has the highest prison population in the world. Gross human rights violations at U.S. detention facilities, including Guantanamo Bay, as well as disproportionate detention and incarceration rates of Black and Latino people in the United States. Now, frankly, the heroes of the United States have not necessarily aligned with the heroes of marginalized people of this country, nor with the heroes of the global South. For instance, former President Trump called for the Black Lives Matter movement to be labeled as a terrorist organization. Now, Fidel Castro has been and will continue to be one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century, and as we continue national dialogue on the different perspectives of his leadership, we must avoid martyrdom as well as outright vilification. Just as we condemn the suppression of dissent in Cuba and discuss the demographic makeup of the Cuban prison population, we must also acknowledge the active role Cuba played in the decolonization of Africa and the Caribbean, the training of professionals from those areas, and efforts of Cuban medical and educational professionals throughout the global South over the past 50 years. Castro's legacy is a 57-year-old revolution that once punched above its weight in world affairs, especially in Latin America, but in more recent years has become a decrepit museum piece of Soviet-style totalitarianism. Over Fidel's objections, Raul Castro has tried to adapt to preserve this regime, including through a reopening to the United States. Too eagerly reciprocated by President Obama, that initiative has brought in more U.S. dollars and tourists, but no relief from stifling and frequently violent repression of speech, assembly, and other basic human rights. For those achievements, however, the Cuban people paid a terrible price, far higher than they could have expected when Castro roared into Havana, promising to restore political freedoms lost under the U.S.-backed dictatorship that he ousted. Though counterproductive to his horrible humane social policies, Castro's political repression reached an extreme that would have made his predecessor, Batista, blush. Now, it began with mass summary executions of Batista officials and soon progressed to internment of thousands of queer citizens, systematic block-by-block surveillance of the entire citizenry, repeated purges, complete with show trials and executions of the ruling party, and punishment for dissident artists, writers, and journalists. Castro's regime learned the totalitarian patron that he chose to offset the U.S. adversary, the Soviet Union, whose offensive nuclear missiles he welcomed, bringing the world to the brink of Armageddon. Castro supported violent, subversive movements in half a dozen Latin American countries, and even in his dotage helped steer Venezuela to economic and political catastrophe. Cuba's pre-Castro economy was overly reliant on sugar export and left many in poverty, and the post-1961 U.S. trade embargo did not help the revolution prosper. but Castro himself by far the lion's share of damage, impoverishing the island through a program of total state control, occasionally punctuated by his own grandiose schemes, from the ill-fated 10 million ton sugar harvest in the 1960s to the brutally austere special period after the Soviet subsidies ended in 1990s. Castro finally died in November 2016. His life was consequential, but his death was anticlimactic. The world had been expecting Castro's demise for at least 10 years when he handed power to his brother Raul because of illness, and Cubans have been waiting far longer. But like Cuban communism, Castro seemingly refused to die, even when his ideas long ago failed to inspire widespread enthusiasm, and indeed led his country to ruin and generated resignation, fear, and rejection among Cubans who had to live under the only totalitarian system this hemisphere has ever seen. Fidel Castro represented the worst of Latin America's centralizing tradition. In the region's history, nobody had so much control over so many aspects of people's lives for so long a period as he did. He achieved it through sheer intolerance and cruelty. From the beginning of the revolution, he did not hesitate to imprison and execute his closest allies, friends, and even children when it served his purposes. People will debate for a long time how many millions of lives he disrupted, how many thousands of political dissidents that he imprisoned, and for how many tens or hundreds of thousands of lives lost for he is responsible. But he was a master of deceit and a cunning manipulator of public opinion. In person, he was a snake charmer, in the words of Peruvian novelist Mario Vargas Llosa. As Yale professor Carlos Erie wrote, his lies were beautiful and so appealing. Here, too, he was one of the most talented of Latin American dictators. Castro justified the worst crimes through the supposed achievement of the greater good, etc. Never mind that the reality was quite different. With all its problems, Cuba, the most developed country in Latin America before the revolution, became relatively less developed and even more dependent on outside powers after the revolution, first on the Soviet Union, then on Venezuela. And if we are to believe Cuba's official leaders, plenty of countries around the world and in Latin America showed equal or greater gains in social development indicators without having to sacrifice civil, political, or economic liberties. The extent of control that the communist nomenclature has in other countries and societies represents an inequality of power that Cuba had never before seen. Castro knew that much of the outside world would overlook that reality and buy into official myths. He didn't always lie. The use of moral equivalence in argumentation, or the old trick of suggesting that criticism of the new regime was the same as support for the old status quo, went a really long way. Castro knew that the world was imperfect, and turned to Cuba into the focal point of what Latin America had long been, a place where outsiders could project their vision or utopia, or express dissatisfaction with the many things wrong with their own societies. In this way, the revolution became useful to intellectuals, journalists, activists, and countless others around the world. In this way also, Castro's cynicism about the downtrodden, world peace or whatnot was unmatched. How the future will unfold in Cuba is unpredictable, but we can expect its military dictatorship to remain in control in the short term and probably longer. The regime has been preparing for Fidel's death for the past decade, and its repression has increased over the past year or two. Now, without Castro, there is less fear to experiment with change. Whatever change comes about, however, will be undertaken by a regime intent on maintaining power. It will be a task that will be harder and harder for anybody to control. This brings me to my next point. The CIA has had a very sketchy past. The CIA has a long history of helping to kill leaders around the world. This intelligence agency has, since 1945, succeeded in deposing or killing a string of leaders, but was forced to cut back after a Senate investigation in the 1970s, as previously mentioned. Although the CIA attempts proved fruitless in the case of Castro, the U.S. intelligence agency has since 1945 succeeded in deposing or killing a string of leaders elsewhere around the world, either directly or, more often, using a sympathetic local military, locally hired criminal, or a pliant dissident. According to the North Korea's Ministry of State Security, the CIA has not abandoned its old ways. In a statement about 4 years ago, it accused the CIA and South Korea's intelligence service of being behind an alleged recent assassination attempt on its leader Kim Jong-un. The attempt involved the use of biochemical substances, including radioactive substance and nanopoisonous substances, and the advantage of this was it does not require access to the target, as their lethal results will appear after 6 or 12 months. The person directly responsible was allegedly a North Korean working for the Foreign Intelligence Agency. A CIA spokesman refused to comment on the allegations, and this silence speaks volumes. But although such a claim cannot be dismissed as totally outlandish, given the long list of U.S. involvement in coups and assassinations worldwide, the agency was forced to cut back on such killings after a U.S. Senate investigation in the 1970s exposed the scale of this operation. Now, following the investigation, the President Gerald Ford signed in 1976 an executive order stating no employee of the United States government shall engage in or conspire in political assassination. The executive order was partly out of embarrassment at the role of the CIA being publicly exposed, but also an acceptance by the federal government that U.S.-inspired coups and assassinations often turned out to be counterproductive. In spite of this, the U.S. has never totally abandoned this strategy, simply changing the terminology from assassination to targeted killings, from aerial bombing of presidents to drone attacks on alleged terrorist leaders. Aerial bomb attempts on leaders include Libya's Muammar Gaddafi in 1986, Serbia's Milosevic in 1999, and Iraqi President Saddam Hussein in 2003. In 1960, the CIA sent a scientist to kill him with a lethal virus, although this became unnecessary when he was removed from office in 1960 by other means. The US has developed a much more sophisticated method than simple assassination, especially in the fields of electronic and cyber warfare. A leaked document obtained by WikiLeaks and released earlier this year showed the CIA in October 2014 looking at hacking into car control systems. That ability could potentially allow for an agent to stage a car crash. Major setbacks in Iran's nuclear program have been blamed on direct or indirect planning of viruses in their computer systems. It is a long way from the crude, albeit imaginative and eventually doomed, methods employed against Castro. In the words of Castro himself, "If surviving assassinations were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal." These are the numerous attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Crime and Cryptic. If you'd like to review source material, feel free to browse the episode description. Please be sure to follow us for more crime, conspiracy, and mystery content. You can follow us on Instagram at Crime and Cryptic. Be sure to leave a good review. It helps us provide consistent quality content. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, stay fresh.